And I want to also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So I will just share my screen. All right, I'll get directly into it. So in this paper, I explore what a hopeful orientation to the future can look like and where hope meets its limits. This is part of a book project that I'm currently working on based on my DECRA research on young women, everyday life, and imagined futures. With this work, I seek to illustrate what a focus on affect and emotion can add to our understanding of young people's orientations to the future, and hopefully also to future making more generally, as part of a broader turn towards time in the social sciences. In the sociology of youth, which is where this work is primarily based, this focus follows a general trend of moving away from a preoccupation with the substantive content of imagined futures to how participants orient themselves to these futures. It also responds to calls for a greater focus on the affective dimensions of future making, or to the ways in which the future is felt. For instance, Julie MacLeod has argued that it's necessary to go beyond a focus on how structural relations shape young people's future orientations, and instead pay attention to what she calls the affective realm in which imagining and enacting the self unfolds. So what does a focus on hope mean? Hope has been explored from various perspectives, ranging from philosophy to psychology, with very different emphasis. Many scholars refer back to Ernst Bloch's now classic philosophical treatise on hope, while in sociology and related fields, hope has received relatively less attention. Despite an increased focus on hope in social science research since the millennium, Alan Peterson and Ian Wilkinson have argued that hope is a sociological blind spot. While this seems to be changing, in contrast to Bloch's emancipatory focus, this recent work on hope takes us on a different path. I don't have the time here to cover this literature in depth, but I will just mention a couple of key insights. So first, hope is seen as linked to imagination, to being able to imagine a future that one can strive toward. In her compelling book, The Paradox of Hope Journeys Through a Clinical Borderland, Cheryl Mattingly writes that, quote, hope lives in an uncertain place, in a kind of temporal lobby. It points us towards a future we can only imagine, unquote. Mattingly also points to another important aspect of hope, which is that in her clinical borderland setting, clinicians and patients often speak different languages of hope. For instance, one based on statistics and probabilities versus one based on spiritual or embodied discourse. Second, a number of scholars also emphasize that hope is different from expectation. It's not something that is directed towards a specific outcome, but it expresses a more general desire for a positive future, but one we cannot count on encountering. And in this vein, Rebecca Coleman suggests that hope and expectation rely on different models of time, with expectation on the one hand referring to a linear model of time, and hope on the other referring to a nonlinear affective temporality. In this paper, similar to what Simone Fullager emphasized yesterday, I'm less concerned with what hope is, and more with what hope does. And further, I'm especially interested in how hope is sustained. I approach hope as an affective orientation to the future, as a specific emotion that characterizes the participant's relation to the future. In the words of Sarah Ahmed, quote, hope anticipates happiness to come, unquote. And it's inherently a future-oriented emotion as it is, quote, directed towards an object that is not yet present, unquote. And so this also signals my double focus on both time and temporality, as well as on hope and emotion, as I dive into my participants' future-making narratives. In turning my focus to hope as a way of effectively orientating oneself to the future, I draw on the work of three scholars in particular. I'm taking inspiration from José Esteban Munoz's work on queer utopias, Lauren Berlant's work on cruel optimism and the impasse, and as I've already flagged, Sarah Ahmed's work on happiness, and I'll just briefly sketch the ideas I draw on to inform how I engage with my data. From Munoz, a key concept I draw on is that of potentiality. Hope and being hopeful is depicted as something positive, something that's associated with actual optimism, because it is related to this potentiality. And Munoz describes this difference between a possibility and potentiality, where a possibility is simply a thing that might happen, in contrast to potentiality, which is, quote, a certain mode of non-being that is imminent, a thing that is present, but not actually existing in the present tense, unquote. So something is a potentiality when it is hinted at or felt in the present without actually existing yet. For Munoz, this indicates the potential for social change and enables us to imagine that things could be otherwise. And this is an important point in relation to my project. In Munoz's own work, he insists on a queer future because, as he says, quote, "the present is simply not good enough," unquote. In a somewhat less dramatic way, my participants also share a present that can be seen as not good enough and a desire for a future that is different. Drawing on Munoz then allows me to approach my participants' future imaginaries and dreams as holding this form of potentiality as not just something that might happen, but something they're already on the way to realizing, however minimally, and thereby something that generates positive affect in the present. Turning to Berlant, many people here will already be familiar with one of their most famous concepts, the notion of cruel optimism. Optimism for Berlant describes an attachment to something, and in principle, this can be productive and generative in the same way that Munoz depicts the striving for a specific, different or better future. But as Berlant's main focus is on relations of cruel optimism, famously defined as when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing, optimism rarely feels optimistic. These different sentiments in Munoz and Berlant's works are central to how I analyze what being hopeful does when I turn to the empirical data, where I'm reading for what Rebecca Coleman terms the heightening and flattening effects in my participants' future imaginations. From Berlant, I also draw on the notion of the impasse, which points to a specific way of being in the present. The impasse describes, quote, "a stretch of time in which one moves around with a sense that the world is at once intensely present and enigmatic," unquote. The impasse is, however, not characterized by movement or direction, and instead it is what Berlant calls a holding station. Both Berlant and Ahmed have been occupied with our attachments to the fantasy of the good life or happiness, whether this is situated in the nuclear family, in specific political systems, or in working life. Of particular relevance for my interest here are what Berlant terms the fraying fantasies about upward social mobility, and they devote significant attention to the efforts that individuals go through as they invest themselves in the fantasy of a better life ahead. Ahmed's concept of happy objects is helpful here to pinpoint what those fantasies of the good life that we become attached to may look like. So, as I mentioned before, this talk is based on my DECRA research. It's a qualitative longitudinal project focusing on young women aged 15 to 25 with interrupted formal schooling, all based in Victoria. I won't spend a lot of time here talking about the design and the data material. I'll just say briefly that I've conducted 99 interviews with 31 women. Around half of those were interviewed 5 times over the course of 2 years, so every 6 months. And the other half participated in one or more, but less than 5 interviews. I also use different creative methods like drawings and object-based methods, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. The participants were predominantly recruited from service providers, with the main criteria being that they had not completed year 12 or otherwise had their educational pathways interrupted. So I'm now going to introduce you to 3 young women who for me are cases of 3 different ways in which hope works. And after this, I'll try to draw some insights that go across these cases. The first case is Matilda, who lives in a regional town 3 hours from Melbourne. She's 20 years old at the time of the first interview, where she's on maternity leave with her first child and pregnant with her second. She lives with her partner, the father of the children, who's looking for work. She left school during year 10, but she still describes herself as someone who loved school and was trying her best. She tried to go back to complete year 12 before she had children and did get a certificate in childhood studies, but had to give up on year 12 qualifications at that stage. Asked about what made her go back to school when she was already working, she described it in the following way. She says, "I don't know. My mom always wanted me to finish school, and I guess I wanted to do it for her. But also, you know, because I just don't feel like there's an opportunity to actually do anything around here, anything that you'd actually earn a decent pay package off of, or, you know, doing what you want to do without education. Like, it's as simple as that. So yeah, I wanted my year 12, and then I wanted to go to uni. I actually wanted to be a nurse originally, and so that was my plan. But yeah, I guess it's a later plan now. And I have a very good reason to do it now. Like, you know, I want to do it for my kids, and I want my kids to do the same thing, you know." So for Matilda, the desire to complete upper secondary education and continue on to further education is not just a matter of following normative pathways. While she does see education as a necessary precursor for a decent pay package, as she says, and in that way is central to the lifestyle and social mobility she aspires to, her ambitions also have very strong relational and emotional drivers, as she's doing it for others. On the one hand, she mentions her mother, who passed away when Matilda was 13, and on the other hand, she states how her daughters are a very good reason to do it now. And in this way, Matilda's educational hopes stretch out in time to tie together past, present, and future. They're bringing these different timescapes together in the present. We can understand education as carrying potentiality in Munoz's sense. Education becomes a ticket that holds the potential for a better future, one that includes social mobility for herself, but also for her children. Importantly, this sense of potentiality is not confined to the future as a distinct temporal destination. Rather, it exists in the present, and it generates positive affects, springing from being invested in education and being a future-oriented subject. So jumping to the third interview, Matilda's investment in education has taken on a manifest character as she tells how she's enrolled in a bridging course that's going to get her ready to start a university program the next year. And she tells about this. I'm just excited. I just want to set a good example for the girls, you know. Coming from this sort of area, a certain level of wealthiness does impact your life. Like, I mean, if I don't go to uni, I feel like I'm always going to be working class, if ever even able to buy a house, you know. Going to uni will change that. I want to set that example for my girls mainly, so they can go and do the same thing. And I would literally be the first person in my family to go to uni, so just fingers crossed I can do it. If I don't try, I'm never going to know. And I mean, what's there to lose, really? At this point, you know, I do feel capable to do it. It's just a matter of how well I divide my time. I am nervous about if I work and study. I'm nervous about the time that I'll be able to spend with my girls, because that's very, very important to me. But we'll see how it goes. I'm scared of failure, but also, like, I can't fail if I don't try. And I think that's a failure also. I don't know. I just want to see where the future takes me in life. I'm excited. I am. I haven't stopped thinking about it. Like, every day I'm like, I can't wait. So this quote illustrates the emotional complexity of Matilda's decision to enroll in a bridging course and then go on to university. This is a choice surrounded by a range of emotions, from excitement, fear, and anxiety to a feeling of hope that this decision in itself signifies. The quote also displays Matilda's strong desire for social mobility, for achieving a better life than what seems to be cut out for her, as someone with her working class background and coming from her area. As the quote attests to, being able to attend university is a source of pride as the first in family to enroll in higher education. And in one sense, the enrollment in itself becomes a marker of how far she's already traveled on her social mobility journey. Matilda's long-term goals, as she says, an image of a better life, involve both the idea of having a career in contrast to just a job, as well as becoming a homeowner, both strong markers of middle-class status. The quote also conveys how central her daughters are to how she orients herself to the future. Already in the first interview, it became clear how being a mother is a key part of Matilda's identity, and she stated that, quote, parenting is not something I want to stuff up, unquote. Even though the quote focuses on the mobility of Matilda herself, the end goal of this may be more about her children's future than her own, paving the way for them to be in a better position for achieving the good life than she herself has been. In this way, the future horizon that Matilda's working within is extended. The future she's working towards is that of her children as an extension of her own. So Matilda's hope that she will be able to bring about the better future for herself, and in particular for her children, rests on her strong belief in hard work and in her own ability to get on with it. Already in the first interview, this became clear as we talked about how she had a job before she even left school. She held various jobs from when she was 14 and didn't seem to have trouble finding work. In responding to my question about how she'd been able to find work, she said that I just did what nobody else wanted to do. So many of my friends, they never had jobs because they didn't want to work in fast food. But I didn't have a choice. Like, I needed the money, and you know, a job's a job. This attitude that a job is a job is recurring across the 3 interviews, despite Matilda being on maternity leave. At the time of the 3rd interview, she's back working and providing for her family, this time as a domestic cleaner. And despite the hard physical labor, Matilda thrives with being the breadwinner again. What comes across in her narrative across the 3 interviews is a strong sense of individual responsibility, a focus on hard work, and a sense of being aspirational, qualities that scholars have characterized as central to a distinctly neoliberal subjectivity. Matilda's being a good neoliberal subject by working hard and believing that hard work is what it takes. The trade-off that Matilda has had to make, though, is to break up with her partner who didn't have, quote, the ambition that I'm looking for, unquote. Sacrificing the ideal or the happy object of the nuclear family to pave the way for her own aspirations makes her sad, but she insists this was the right choice. Drawing a boundary between the mindsets of herself and the ex-partner also positions her as the one with ambition, an independent woman who aspires and actively seeks to make positive changes to the present situation. So moving on to my second case, I want to turn to Norma, who was 22 years old at the time of the first interview. She lived on the outskirts of Melbourne with her family. She was slightly older than most participants, and in contrast to most, she'd actually completed year 12, but she was still trying to find out what to do next now, 4 years later. So what she wants is, as she says, quote, a good job that I really like, unquote. And we can already here sense a difference compared to the way in which Matilda before spoke about a job is a job. But Norma finds it hard to settle on any one direction, as her interests often change, and this makes her question, what is a genuine interest of hers? She says, I have an idea of what I want to do, but I'm not quite sure still, because it changes. At the moment, I'm thinking I still want to work in hospitality, like a waitress and stuff. It's pretty good. I did a beauty course, which I really liked. I really wanted to get into beauty. I wanted to be a makeup artist. I'm questioning that now. It's still in my mind, like if I want to be a makeup artist, or it was one of my goals. I'm not sure what happened to it now, but I think if I really wanted to, I could. But at the moment, I'm kind of not thinking that much into the future, because that's what I want to do, like in the future. For now, I'm kind of thinking in the present and how I want to do waitressing and stuff. So Norma seems somewhat paralyzed by the risk of not making the right choice for her future. And as she tries different areas of work, she seeks to sense if maybe this time it feels right. If she likes something, does she like it enough? Deciding on a future line of work is not about the job prospects or the salary level, but about finding something that she's really into, something that feels right. The way in which Norma seeks to handle this uncertainty is to distinguish between her present, her near future, and the more distant future, or what she terms the future. While we may theoretically want to be careful with making sharp distinctions between present and future as separate entities, for Norma there's a clear benefit to holding on to these distinctions between different timescapes, as this allows her to sort of park her somewhat paralyzing deliberations about her future line of work, and instead focus on getting a job in hospitality here and now. These two timescapes can then proceed independently of each other. She can look for a job in hospitality for her immediate future, and she can consider or pause the considerations about her line of work in the distant future. When we meet for the second interview, it's a very different Norma I encounter. She's recently gotten a job in hospitality, and she exudes a confidence and energy that was not present in the first interview. She says, I've been saving my money and stuff for like my future, and I feel like things are working out. Like for my future life, it's going to be a good future because I'm working now, and that's the start of it. Finding a job has meant a marked change in not only Norma's everyday life routines and financial situation, but how she thinks about her future too. The job is the start of it. The future's here, and she's now optimistic about it. It's going to be a good future. With Ahmed in mind, we can think of the relation that Norma has established between work and her future as one that makes work her happy object. For Norma and in broader discourse, work holds the promise of a happy future. By getting close to working life, a happy future becomes within reach. This is also evident in the quote below from a little later in the same interview. So getting a job has changed my mood, she says, how I am now. Job and money, and it does change your mood a little bit. Having a routine, you feel like normal and good again, and I'm in a happier mood, like you're doing something. I feel a bit more normal now. I mean, I'm still normal, but like sometimes you feel like not doing anything for a while, you start, something in your mind makes you feel bad. When you get back into the world again, and like here, how I got out in the open, something in your mind, like with your thoughts, goes back to normal, like how it should be. Because, you know, when you're bored and stuff, your mind can make up a whole bunch of cruel thoughts and stuff like that. So there are a few points to make here. First of all, the constitution of work as Norma's happy object is not only related to the promise of happiness in the future, but it's already impacting her in the present through changes to what she calls her mood, something we can understand with Munoz's notion of the potentiality stemming from sensing futures in the present. Second, going to work, even if just a couple of days a week, embeds Norma in a routine, and this gives her a sense of purpose that makes her feel busy, as she says. Being busy also means not having time for, quote, thinking stuff in your head, or what she calls the cruel thoughts that are making her feel bad. Thinking with Signe Ravn's concept of ugly feelings, these bad thoughts, Norma's depression and anxiety, are not the result of individual malfunction, but rather a reaction to social conditions like a non-inclusive youth labour market. Being busy enables Norma to get rid of those bad feelings, and this makes her feel, quote, a bit more normal. And while she links this to her mind, to when her mind goes back to normal, she says, it is also tempting to consider this in light of Berlant's analysis of the struggles that come from insecure work in the informal economy at the bottom of society and what they term, quote, the positive effects of aspirational normativity, unquote. When we meet for the third interview, however, Norma is no longer working and her mood is back to low, and jumping a further 6 months ahead to the fourth interview, this is still the case. The increased distance to the labour market makes it difficult to maintain the heightening affects that were visible in the second interview. And she says, I just went through a bit of depression again. It came back. I think it's due to the jobs and stuff, because I felt like I didn't get it and I was really down. And I wanted to, because now it's been almost another year and I haven't worked. I know that this is happening now, but there is still like hope in the future that like things will probably get better again. Something probably that I didn't expect that come up. Like I'll have a good opportunity in the future. At this stage, hope is something that is not associated with the present, but rather something that resides in a future that is separate from the present. Perhaps surprisingly, she's still insisting that, quote, there's still hope in the future, despite the challenges she's going through in the present. And we might say that it is this hope in the hope of the future that keeps her going in the present. The unhappiness that comes with the feeling of getting further away from finding work makes Norma turn inward to find the faults in herself. This is something that's even more visible in the last interview. And she's saying, yeah, so I just like started realizing stuff about myself and thinking about things a lot. And like, even with my depression and with my overthinking, I actually realized I can't keep, like, I have to do something. I can't be like this forever, or I'm going to keep being miserable. I really need to get a job. I need to put the right mindset on. I want to change and I want to become more positive as well, because I realized I was really negative and the negativity is the cause of a lot of the things. And the photo here on the side is from a photo elicitation exercise. And this is a card or poster she has on her bedside table and can look at every morning to remind her to try and put on this positive attitude. So in this last quote, we see how Norma comes to see her mindset as standing between herself and her happy object. And we also get a sense both here and in the previous quote that Norma is waiting for something to happen. And we might think of Norma's situation here as an impasse, a stretched out present that doesn't really have a direction, but merely is a holding station. And while Norma is hopeful that the future will be different, especially if she can change herself, Berlant encourages us to consider whether a situation like this is indeed an impasse or what they call life itself. So the last case I'll introduce here is Alicia, who was 17 years old at the time of the first interview, and she worked in a cafe. She lived with her middle-class parents and siblings. She left school in year 10 because of her mental health, which is consistently not great over the course of the 5 interviews. This goes back to primary school, but has become worse since year 8. According to herself, her diagnoses include anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, an eating disorder, and a psychosis at one point. When I first interview Alicia and ask about how she thinks about the future and how she thinks her life will look in 5 years from now, she says, I don't really know what my life is going to look like. Like, ideally, just like completely rich, not a worry in the world. I think that's everyone's dream though, but that's not going to happen, at least not in 5 years' time. It's probably just having a clear idea of what I want and where to get there. That's, I'm ready to start. And I say, and this is stressing you not having a goal, or are you just sort of concerned with, my life right now is about living life in the moment, like that's fine, or is this a thing that you wish you already knew? And she says, I do. When I think about my future, it's really scary. Like, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I want to do. So I just try not to think about it all that often. For Alicia, imagining the future generates a range of negative emotions such as stress and anxiety. The lack of certainty about what she wants to do in the future is scary, and therefore something she tries to avoid thinking about. Rather than hoping to be in a particular life situation in 5 years' time, she just hopes for some clarity. Her present job in a cafe is not necessarily something she sees as a stepping stone to a future career. And when we meet for the second interview, she's quit the job because she was overworked, and this was draining on her mental health. While she's still actively looking for work and gets called in for job interviews, she describes herself as, quote, fairly mentally unwell at the moment, unquote, and is therefore okay to be at home with little to do. However, this is impacting her mood and her thoughts about the future, and she states that, quote, it does feel a little bit hopeless at the moment, unquote. Jumping to the fourth interview with Alicia 1 year later, a number of things in her life have changed. She's completed a Cert 4 in hospitality, which she enjoyed. She also has a new job in a restaurant, and she's moved out of home to her own place. However, unfortunately, the restaurant has recently let her go, leaving her in a tight financial situation, as she now has rent to pay. To manage financially, she started doing sex work, but this also brings with it feelings of shame. As we talk about what she's thinking when looking 5 years ahead, she responds, "Work's definitely a priority. As for further study, I don't even know what industry I study, because I really enjoy hospitality, but I don't know if that's what I want to do my whole life. I have to figure that out." It just brings up this whole other question about whether I'm going to be like alive in 10 years' time, because I've had a really steady decline in my mental health. So Alicia's suicidal feelings and lack of hope for her own future brings a renewed sense of gravity to the interview that coexists with her more mundane considerations about what kinds of work she would like to do next. And a parallel conversation unfolds in the 5th and last interview with her. On the one hand, Alicia has enrolled in a new 2-year course, and she speaks about her excitement for this. While on the other hand, she repeats her concerns that she will no longer be here in 5 years' time, and she describes actual suicide attempts and a feeling that she's tried everything to make her mental health better, but without success, and that this makes a sense of hope for the future very limited. To unpack this complexity, I want to turn to Sarah Ahmed once again. Ahmed writes that, quote, "Hope and hopeful subjects are well adjusted because they have adjusted to a demand they do not know has been made," unquote. Alicia, on the other hand, is refusing to be a well-adjusted subject in that she does not buy into the hopefulness and belief in happy futures ahead, which we saw Matilda and Norma strive towards. But as Ahmed also suggests, quote, "To walk away from such happiness is to be touched by suffering," unquote. And Alicia is indeed suffering. If we follow Ahmed, this is a way of setting oneself free from the demands of happiness or the demands of hoping for a happy future. And while for Ahmed this is a positive thing, she also makes it clear that taking this position is not easy, in that, quote, "The freedom to be unhappy would be the freedom to be affected by what is unhappy and to live a life that might affect others unhappily," unquote. And this is clear in Alicia's narrative too. She describes how she feels that people around her, her parents who've otherwise been depicted as supportive throughout the interviews, they have also given up on her getting better, and that, quote, "Everyone is sick of me being sick," unquote. Perhaps for this reason, we see her move back and forth between, or perhaps rather coexist in, 2 different time tracks or timescapes. On the one hand, one that follows conventional temporal norms and projects a future that chronologically follows the present. And on the other hand, one that disrupts this linear thinking. Perhaps a way of reading this is to see Alicia as suggesting a preoccupation with the present rather than the future. For her, the fact that the present is not good enough, to paraphrase Munoz once more, does not simply mean an investment in the hope for a better future, but rather an exploration of how to live better in the present as a precursor to engaging in future making. So to start wrapping up and drawing some tentative conclusions, I want to first briefly take stock and consider what an approach that pays attention to affective orientations to the future can add to our understanding of future making. Exploring how the future feels may allow us to understand, for instance, the relational and emotional components that make Matilda invest so strongly in education. It also enables us to unpack how hope can do different things for different participants, such as Norma's abstract hope that something will happen and she just has to wait for it, compared to the sense of potentiality and betterment that Matilda's hope for the future creates as she's already making her future. However, what I also want to do here, by way of conclusion, is to draw our attention to the work it requires to be and remain a hopeful subject. While hope has in some of the previous literature been depicted as a form of defeatist orientation to the future, I want to emphasize the work it takes to cultivate a sense of hope and remain hopeful. Hope is not an effortless emotion, and here I want to point to 3 different forms of work that the analysis in this paper demonstrates or highlights. So first, there is emotion work. This includes, for instance, Matilda's attempts at curbing her anxiety about going back to studying and managing both work, study, and childcare at the same time, and instead focus on the sense of potentiality and the excitement that this decision also entails for her. It also includes Norma's efforts to think positive and not be caught up in her bad thoughts. Second, to remain hopeful requires self-work. Being a hopeful subject is not an invitation open to each and every one. On the contrary, it calls for specific subjectivities, and as we saw, my participants are trying to cultivate such subjectivities. This was particularly clear in the case of Norma, who wanted to be a better subject, who has the right mindset in order to be employable. But we also saw how Matilda was emphasizing her work ethic, her responsibility, and her ability to get on with things as qualities that were central for realizing the hopes she held for her future. And lastly, we have seen how different forms of time work is involved in the efforts to maintain hope. In Matilda's case, this was a matter of extending the time horizon she operates within to not only encompass her own future, but also that of her children. And in Norma's case, this was a matter of creating a clear separation between the present and the future in order to be able to be hopeful about that future. It was explicitly a not here yet future, in contrast to Matilda's future. I also want to complicate ideas about that having hope or being hopeful is necessarily a positive thing. Much like the notion of resilience, which sociologists hold a good amount of skepticism towards, hope can be a problematic and individualizing neoliberal entity. And so there's much to gain by looking closely at what goes on in those moments when hope is refused, such as when Alicia voices her doubts about her own future. One place where we find theorizations of such refusals of hope and critiques of reproductive futurity is in queer theory. As Rachel Thompson and Jeanette Østergaard suggest, queer temporalities, quote, might help us understand the lives of those who have not done things in the correct order and whose inability or unwillingness to deliver reproductive futurism renders them as outsiders, failures, or rebels, unquote. Not doing things in the correct order, for instance, not engaging in education, work, and child rearing in the normatively prescribed order, is a logic that applies to many of my participants, but it may be particularly insightful in cases such as Alicia, whose two-track time work complicates traditional conceptions of chronological time. And in that way, it also becomes clear how problematizing hope is not only a way of problematizing a specific emotion, but also a specific conception of temporality and time as chronological and forward-oriented. Other dimensions to add here would be questions about who gets to be a hopeful subject, or in other words, how this hopeful subject is also constituted by structural and institutional forces through what Ghassan H has called a political economy of hope, driven by what Christina Brunila and colleagues have termed the positivity imperative. This is beyond the scope of what I can cover today, but nevertheless important questions for a full account of how hope works and the work required to hope. So what does this approach to hope give us analytically? Rethinking hope in this way, it allows us to ask questions about not only what hope does, but also what it takes to be hopeful. And exploring the work it takes to be hopeful allows us to consider questions about subjectivity and temporality. And lastly, we become able to step beyond a singular focus on hope as something positive, to instead consider both the heightening and flattening effects that hope generates. And I think I'll just leave that here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Signe. I'm really sorry if you can hear the chainsaw that's just started up outside my window, which is, you know, the tyranny of working from home. But that was I really liked your point about the work that sustaining hope involves. But I think we might have a question from Renee, so I might pass over to Renee, and I'll just put myself on mute. So.
Hi, Signe. So nice to see you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks, you.
That was so wonderful. Your data was just so rich, and I'm really jealous. I'd love to be able to have a method where I get to interview people over time, multiple times. And I was just wondering if there was any component in your method where you asked the young women that you interviewed to reflect on how, I mean, we all know that the interviews and method are co-constituted and, creates both of our experiences and the data. But if they'd been asked to reflect on how these interviews, especially those participants that might have done 5 interviews, how that changed their orientations to the future, because it seems to me that, this is such a classed experience, and, we're basically asking, you're asking these participants to reflect on class and, to reflect on their employment and labour precarity and stuff. And so I just wondered, especially for those participants that had done, multiple interviews, if they'd reflect reflected back to you, or if you'd asked them to reflect back to you how that changed their orientations to the future and to Labor and to themselves, because I thought that might have been the case.
I've asked about that. Thanks a lot for that point, and it gets very central, I think, to, and I've sort of left out all that kind of reflection on methodology and so on in this talk, just to try and cram it in. But it's of course really important. I think that when I've asked them about it, they're sort of mainly sort of saying how it's been nice to do make those kinds of reflections, or engage in those kinds of reflections, because they wouldn't otherwise do it. And of course we know that that interviews are not, they're artificial situations, and we're sort of starting these conversations that wouldn't otherwise take place, and they wouldn't otherwise engage in. It's sort of, there's not really sort of any of them where I can specifically say that they would have told me, or that where I can see that they started thinking differently about their future, or that they've started doing things, at least not where I feel confident saying that this is because they participated and so on. Another way of reflecting on it is so maybe to think about that the focus on education, how much of that is a result or an implication of me, obviously, representing higher education as I'm coming there with my university cap on, and in that sense, sort of, it might feel like the right thing to do in that interview to emphasize that you're still planning to get back to education. And so there's a number of them that do say that and that keep emphasizing that. And some of them then also do go back to various forms. Some do go back to TAFE, and some enroll in some other kind, like the bridging course that we saw here. So it takes on different forms. But there's also others who are sort of quite insisting that it's not for them, or it's not. So sort of resisting, I guess, their sort of temptation to conform to that expectation in the interview about education being the right thing.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'd love to do some interviews like that. I just think it gives you such a different perspective, because even like being asked these kinds of questions in an interview, it might finish and you walk away and think, oh wow, I've never been asked to articulate my desires for the future in this kind of particular kind of way. But then to know that you're going to be speaking to this person 5 times, it might mean that, the next time you're at work and you have this experience, you're like, oh, you start to maybe reframe those in the kind of in the politics or ethics of the project that you're involved in. I just think it's really fascinating, and get that. But that's just a comment. You don't need to keep going on about it. I think Kieran has a question I can see.
Thanks, Renee.
No worries.
Thanks, Renee.
Thanks so much, Signe. That was such a rich, beautiful, beautifully theorized account of your DECA research. And I love the way you wove in queer theory and Ahmed's work and Esteban Munoz. It was, just masterfully done. I was really interested, and it kind of segues from your point and Renee's point. I was interested in what you were talking about, who gets to be a hopeful subject and the positivity imperative. And I know you said you didn't have an opportunity to explore that, or at least in this presentation. And I was quite struck by Alicia, and she seemed to be the only one kind of resisting the neoliberal imperatives of being a productive subject. And I was just curious to know, was her case anomalous, or were other participants similarly kind of skeptical or critical? I'd just love to know a bit about how her case featured amongst your data set, if it was anomalous or if there were people resisting those imperatives.
There's a few other than her. She's maybe the most sort of outspoken. There's one other who's maybe almost as outspoken, but there's mainly those two where it's that clear, and kind of clear across most of the interviews, that there is that kind of resistance to engage in, like that kind of thinking, so there's those two clear cases. There's a few others where there's little bits of it, but they are sort of out of the sort of broader sample of 31, they are not the majority. So there are these few of them, but I think that, not being about the numbers here, but I think that it is sort of like, it really is important to consider what it is that's going on. And I'm not sure if I've grasped it in the right way yet, but I think that those moments of sort of refusal, or at least sort of resistance, are really important to consider. What are the broader imperatives that are at work, and that maybe most of them, sort of following on from Renee's comment, kind of fall in line, or they take up the task, or take that task on them in various ways. So those who don't just do that, I think that's a really sort of important thing to try and consider sociologically.
Absolutely, thanks so much, Signe. Yeah, and it just shows how strong those imperatives are, that most of the participants appear, at least in places, to conform to them.
Thanks, Kieran. Does anybody have any questions? So feel free to pop a question in the chat if you're a bit shy and you don't want to speak on put your face on camera and speak to the microphone. But just while we're sort of waiting to see if there's any further questions, I think I have one about this. You know, obviously there's this suggestion we draw on Lauren Berlant's idea of that, you know, the contemporary moment might be an impasse kind of in itself. And you can see how for some young women that there's that refusal because the kind of, I guess, that possibility of hope is not necessarily kind of available in the sort of in their trajectories. What types of sort of social kind of interventions or supports are needed to really support the development of kind of hopeful subjectivities, do you think, for these young women that you're speaking with?
That's a really easy question, Nicholas. Thanks for that one. I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I think that when we think of it sort of follows up on from what Kieran was saying, but when we think of these imperatives to be hopeful and sort of keep going in that sense, that some of what I think is going on there is also related to some of these service providers that they are engaging with, and how that kind of like, you know, like if you just like, you know, format your CV a little bit differently, then it'll be so much better, and then then we can send it out to all these employers, and sort of these little things that are seen as being part of that, you know, the machinery of hope is how I think of it, like how hope is produced and generated and governed in those kinds of moments and institutions, and how that is trying to sort of install that kind of hope in those subjects. But then, so I think like thinking more about whatever, like not a concrete solution, but more sort of about what is it that those employment services are actually able to offer, and is it fair to sort of set up this idea about, you know, like what kind of job is it you'll get? There are not many permanent ongoing jobs out there who are like, you know, good jobs. What is it that, yeah, sorry, Renee, when I talk about services, they are mainly all recruited through different kinds of service providers that seek to re-engage young people with either education or employment. And so and a lot of them are looking for work, and in this, it's sort of like what kind of, maybe by being more realistic about what is that kind of work that, you know, that we're looking for, what is it that is actually possible, and being more sort of straight about that, because it feels like there is this sort of underlying thing in that space, in that service space about if we just adjust these little things, then there will be this, you know, great job for you. And I'm not sure there are that many great jobs out there in that way. So that is not necessarily generating hope, but that is maybe at least taking away some of those kinds of tensions around, yeah, like the imperative to be positive when there's maybe not much to be positive or hopeful about in terms of finding work. I'm not sure if that sort of responds to your question.
Yeah, no, it is definitely. And I think kind of in sort of my PhD research, there was one, you know, a few participants where they're sort of doing all this self-work, and, you know, like they're in their 50s, kind of, you know, engaging with life coaches, all of these sorts of sort of self-help strategies, and are really hopeful about the future. But the reality is the nature of their employment market at that time is probably not going to let them in, even though there's this, so that idea of the cruel optimism. But I think there's a couple of questions from Kieran and Lena about the method. If you could talk a little bit about the sort of creative methods that you've used, and also one from Yardena. Sorry, there's a few going in the chat at the moment, and about engagement over time of participants.
So about retention. So it's sort of half of those 31 women that I started out with that kind of stayed on throughout those 5 interviews, and then obviously half that kind of didn't, but where some participated just in 1 interview and some in a few interviews. And then for some of them, it's kind of like this sort of last fourth and fifth interviews sort of clashed with COVID stuff last year, and that I think also added to that, to people dropping out and just not having the energy or time or capacity even to do this. And so there was a clear sort of drop in that as well. In terms of methods, it's I've used sort of different creative methods in different interviews. So the first one is set up as a more biographical interview, and I've used this kind of life chart exercise where we map what they see as important moments or people who've sort of been part of shaping their life and who they are today. That's briefly what I sort of would say to them. And so this is sort of like they draw on a piece of paper and plot events or people. And of course, that's a quite sort of that's sort of enforcing or facilitating a quite linear idea about time as, you know, progressing. And some of them, not many, but some would sort of like draw more sort of curvy lines that weren't just as sort of straight, you know, forward moving. But I think that is sort of like a known critique of that method. In the second interview, I used the mapping exercise. I was interested in sort of notions around belonging, something I haven't really included in this talk, but was interested in how they sort of, yes, had the sense of belonging in relation to their local area. So they drew a map of that area, and then they put post-its that were, you know, blue or red, sort of like, I think red for the areas or places they liked and blue for the places they disliked, to sort of try and add that kind of whatever emotional layer to that map thing. In the third interview, I used an object exercise where they brought two objects to the interview. So one was an object that related to their past, and one was an object that they saw as relating to their future. And I've written a paper about that, and that was that sort of worked quite well. A lot of these things I think, or methods, I'm sort of experimenting a bit with it, and it doesn't always, you know, doesn't always do a whole lot of productive stuff. But sometimes I feel like that it does do or generate different or more sort of insightful or fruitful accounts. And I think that object method is really one I enjoyed and they enjoyed working with, and that seemed quite interesting for sort of thinking about future in a different way. Then there's a bit of photo elicitation and then a bit of Play-Doh modeling, which kind of had to be cut short because then COVID and you couldn't sit there with like whatever stuff. So yeah, so that one is quite half-baked.
Yeah. So, and there's another question from Yardena, which is around, for the participants that were interviewed 5 times, what was the final interview with them like? Was it kind of a reflective kind of the process? And, you know, just talking about, I guess, focusing on the relationship that you've built up through the research itself.
Yeah, so it was quite, or somewhat at least emotional. Like I wouldn't say that I'm friends with these young women. I think that's, you know, granting myself too much of a role there, but definitely sort of come to know each other to some extent over those 2 years, and have shared a lot, and they obviously have shared by far the most about their own lives. So it was sort of like ending with like, yeah, hugs and like take care, and sort of I've given them my details so like we can sort of, you know, I'm there, so whatever resource in whatever way that might be helpful for them in the future. But I think that is a really sort of difficult way, like ending that kind of longitudinal research where you have formed bonds, as you say in the question there in the chat, and where it's a little bit unclear how those can continue, should they continue, like the ethics around that. And so I've tried to make it an offer that I'm happy to be in touch if they are interested in being in touch and would check in. And so I've had like a couple of emails or, you know, messages where it's just like, hey, I just wanted to let you know I've started this new job, and it's or sort of saying something about themselves. And for others, I think it's just like, you know, it's fine, it's done. Like they don't have a need for staying in touch.
Yes. Okay, I think there's a question from Raylene Wilding in the chat, looking at the role of cultural and linguistic diversity in your projects, and whether you've seen any evidence of hope generating differently for people from different cultural or linguistic backgrounds.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of stuff to say. I think my sample is sort of relatively wide in many ways. There's a few participants who've migrated here as sort of older teenagers, but I don't have a lot. I don't think I can sort of say anything that is a bit more systematic based on that from those couple of cases. So I don't think I don't really feel equipped to answer that question properly, or to say anything about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I think that might be all, but I think the idea of kind of belonging in place is like quite interesting, and sort of links into this idea of sort of social structures, but sort of this might be a bit difficult because you have kind of written this paper and sort of park the belonging stuff aside, but so just bear with me. But I was thinking, like, how does sort of like your participant sense of belonging kind of, how is your participants' sense of belonging implicated in their kind of sense of hope about the future? Because obviously you're working in areas where there's socioeconomic disadvantage and all of these sorts of things.
Yeah, so I've tried to analyze or focusing on this sense of belonging in relation to sort of mobility and immobility, and focusing in particular on the one location I have that's regional, so around 3 hours away from Melbourne, in a sort of disadvantaged area where the employment prospects aren't great, and sort of it's sort of known for whatever social problems, and so like I've written a paper about that, and it's about sort of how this idea about like the mobility imperative, as David Fruger has called it, how sort of that idea about young people wanting to and also should be moving to cities for all sorts of opportunities, both in terms of education or work, but also for sort of lifestyle opportunities. Like that's where the cities where you want to be when you're young, sort of thing. That is complicated by those kinds of strong relational ties that those women have to their local communities. So even though they see lots of sort of problems and challenges ahead in terms of finding work or the partner finding work locally, they're not necessarily thinking they'll move. So that sense of belonging is very much tied to those social relations that sort of tie them in place in that sense, and sort of make their aspirations more like about social aspirations. So they're not necessarily about how can I find my own sort of happy future, but what is it that, like, what is that, how does that look in a more social way? So that's about, for instance, thinking about their families or their sort of broader social networks, but how that is taking that broader lens.
Yeah.
So that becomes maybe not so sort of direct, like, so their hope is more about sustaining those kinds of relations in place, in a sense.
Yeah, so sort of like almost livability or something, sort of what creates the sort of meaning in this sort of social context, and
that's not just singularly that's not just tied to like employment prospects, for instance.
And I think I guess we've got a couple more minutes, but there's one question from Sandy, and I think that might be the final one. But what would you say steals hope from young people?
Maybe it's just sort of coming back to what I was trying to say a little bit before when I was trying to respond to your question, Nicholas, about how those, like, you get told that if you just do the hard yards, or like work hard, or put in these applications, or take that whatever course, like then there will be this job for you. But obviously that's not the case, and so those kinds of false promises I don't know if they necessarily always steal away, but they definitely challenge the potential for hope in that sense. But then I think, like, thinking about Alicia, like the last case, like there's many things going on also for some of these young women, for instance, in terms of mental health. And so there's sort of these other barriers to thinking about how life could be, happy or good, because of those kinds of challenges that are hard to see how they could go away.
Yeah. Okay. I like the idea that that you're highlighting the difficult choices that people have to make to kind of choose between different potentialities of hope, and one happy object kind of outweighs the other, and sort of there's sacrifice in kind of maintaining that sense of hope. as well. So thank you, Signe. That was amazing. There's when you get a chance, there's a lot of comments in the chat, and feel free to pop through kind of any maybe the paper that you referred to in the chat, so everyone can sort of access that, because people seem to be quite interested in your talk. And so thank you
very much, and thanks for all the great comments and questions.